welcome to the Explore the Circular Economy show by the MacArthur Foundation, where we talk about the transition away from a linear take, make, waste economy to one where we design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. We're streaming out on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Facebook and Twitter every single Tuesday from 12 p.m. BST. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Seb. I'm from the learning team here at the Foundation. And I'm once again rejoined by my co-host Laura today. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, thank you, Seb. I'm also part of the Learning and Comms team here at the Foundation, and I'm very excited to be co-hosting today's show, where we're going to be exploring the crucial role that the circular economy can play in tackling climate change. Who has joined us today, Seb?
Our guest today is from the Foundation's Insight Analysis team, Suki. She's worked on a number of projects in her time here at the Foundation, but perhaps most notably, at least for this conversation, she was the lead researcher and author on the Completing the Picture paper we published on the role that circular economy can play in tackling climate change. We published it last September. So great to have Suki on the show today.
Welcome, Suki. We are really excited to have you here. So let's dive in. And most people probably watching this show can probably agree that climate change is such a big issue nowadays. And I mean, we've seen it on the news. A lot of people are suffering it within their communities, and there are signs that it's becoming increasingly important at the moment with at the highest levels with the 2015 Paris Agreement, the European Union Green New Deal, just to name a couple of them. But maybe to start with, you could remind us, why is there such an urgency attached to this issue?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. And yes, of course. So we are all acutely aware of being in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, but what we also find ourselves in the middle of is a climate emergency. And the question here is, how can we avoid the next global crisis, right? So if we look at climate change, science shows that we must keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And to do that, we must aim for net zero emissions by 2050 if we are to avoid irreversible climate effects and avoid devastating impacts on our society, economy, and environment. And the problem we find ourselves in today is that we're nowhere near to meeting our climate goals. And if we fail to significantly reduce our emissions, then the carbon budget we have to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees will be used up within less than 8 years. And so this is quite problematic, and it leaves us with very little time. And in order to be able to tackle this, we really need ambitions to be much more ambitious, and we need transformative actions.
And I mean, that story, as Lara kind of fronted up with, is probably quite familiar to many people watching this episode. Don't worry, guys, it's going to get even more positive as the show progresses, but that's the context. What our viewership will also possibly be kind of thinking, or maybe assuming, is, well, this is really about transitioning to renewable energy. It's about transitioning away from fossil fuel-based energy sources of energy to renewable energy. Is that true?
It is very important. So when we talk about tackling climate change, renewable energy and energy efficiency are absolutely critical in our fight against climate change. And we can already see tremendous progress taking place that's already achieving already. A great example is how renewable energy and energy efficiency has been estimated to be able to provide 90% of the energy-related emissions reduction by 2050. So that's very exciting. And it really helps show how much progress we're already making. However, I think the issue we wanted to highlight in the paper is that although renewable energy and energy efficiency are really critical, it just won't be enough if we are to reach these net zero emissions by 2050. And this is what we wanted to highlight.
And just a very quick clarifying question. Energy efficiency. What do we mean when we talk about energy efficiency?
We're talking about being able to do the same amount of performance, but then with less energy, which is critical. I mean, these are things that we look at, for example, within the built environment or in the way we produce our goods. But yeah, so these are, and especially renewable energy, there's a lot of attention on that, and it's absolutely important. But if we are to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we will need more solutions to help us basically close that emissions gap.
And Suki, could you elaborate a little bit on this? Why is it not enough, as you say, to shift to renewable energies and invest in energy efficiency?
Yeah, and this is a good question. I think we get that question quite a lot. And I have a slide 1, if you could share that with the audience. But this basically is an image that shows the 55 versus 45. So if we look at the global emissions today, all of the CO2 emitted around the world, of that, around 55% of those emissions come from the energy sector. So these are emissions that come from the burning of fossil fuels for the production of energy and for heat generation, but it's also the burning of fossil fuels for within your building. So for heating, cooking, lighting, but also for transportation. And these emissions, that 55%, can more easily be tackled through renewable energy and energy efficiency. But the question here is, what about the overlooked emissions? What about the remaining 45%? And here, the remaining 45% comes from the way we produce our goods and manage our land. So these are emissions, for example, that come from the way we produce our goods, but also from the way we produce materials like steel, cement, aluminium, and plastic. And these emissions cannot easily be tackled through renewable energy and energy efficiency. It's a lot trickier. So to give you I guess, a simple and an illustrative example, if I were to say to you car emissions, what do you think of?
I think of the exhaust pipe.
Right. So if you think of car emissions, exactly. So you think of exhaust fumes. So when we talk about how can we tackle these greenhouse gas emissions, you think of electrification. How can we electrify our cars? And this is definitely an important step towards tackling these emissions. But what about the car itself? And what about all the energy that went into making that car? How do we tackle those emissions? And so this is the untold story. Those are the overlooked emissions that we try to address in the paper.
And so we're talking about here, like actually making plastics or steel involves quite a bit of energy going into the production processes, and there's energy inputs and emissions that come from those energy inputs across the value chain, not just in these specific big industries that are powered directly by industry, like a building, for example. What, Suki, my question to you is, what makes these emissions so hard to tackle? I'm talking about the 45% that now.
Yeah. So let's take a look at these 4 materials, right? So steel, cement, aluminum, and plastic. There are 3 key factors that make it quite difficult for renewable energy and energy efficiency to solve. And these come down to process emissions, high melting temperatures, and end-of-life treatment. So if we look at process emissions, here we're talking about the chemical processes in the making of materials like iron, cement, and plastic. So turning iron to iron oxide, the calcination of limestone to make cement. Plastic in itself is made of carbon. These chemical processes emit CO2 or require carbon. These are things that happen when you're making materials. You cannot really solve this through renewable energy. When we talk about high melting temperatures, steel is a great example. You need temperatures that go all the way up to 2000 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of innovation happening in terms of electrification, and that is very exciting. However, currently it is not put up at scale, and it's not yet very cost effective. So the reality of the situation is that we are still very much dependent on the burning of fossil fuels to generate these very high temperatures. And then the end-of-life treatment, plastic is a great example here. A lot of the plastic today is still being incinerated. When you incinerate plastic, you emit CO2. Again, all these examples cannot be tackled through renewable energy and energy efficiency. We need different system-level solutions that address the way we produce and use our materials.
And I think what I like about what you're saying, sorry to jump in again, but is that we could make the transition to renewables, 100% renewable powered buildings, transportation systems, and our like energy system, energy sector. and we still would only be, I mean, and it's it's a significant percentage, 55%, but we'd still be only 55%, only be tackling 55% of the emissions, which isn't enough to achieve the targets and goals and ambitions that you set out in the introduction.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
And this episode is called Tackling Climate Change, the Case for a Circular Economy, for a reason. And Seb has mentioned in the beginning of the show the 3 principles of the circular economy: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible, and regenerating natural systems. So Suki, my question is, how can the circular economy help us tackle the remaining 45%? And it would be great if you could illustrate this with some examples.
So I'll just use the 3 principles, and this is a simplification, but it just helps illustrate. But I'll go, for example, if we're talking about designing out waste, what you're inherently doing is you're avoiding virgin materials that are being produced, then wasted, and landfilled. So you're avoiding the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with virgin materials, the production of those. You're avoiding also the emissions that are associated with the incineration of it. So by designing out waste, you're tackling these emissions. And then you've got keeping materials in use. In this principle, when you do that, when you keep materials being recirculated within the economy, what you're doing is you're preserving all of the energy that went into making that product. You're preserving it for longer within the economy. And then we've got regenerating natural systems. And with that specifically, we're talking about bringing nutrients back into the soil, creating healthier soils. And by doing that, you're preserving and maintaining the carbon sequestration potential of soils so they can act as carbon sinks. So again, it's a simplification, but it shows how each of these principles contribute to reducing greenhouse gas. And I guess I could offer a few examples to illustrate this. I have 2 examples, the car and the food system. But I'll start with the car because I had used this earlier on today as an example. But I'll start with designing out waste. When we talk about car production, there's a lot of scrap material that's generated during the production. So how can we eliminate waste across the supply chain? And here you've got new industrial processes, or you could think of substituting with different materials that are more efficient, material efficiency, and these kind of things. What you're doing, again, you're avoiding virgin material production that ends up being wasted in landfills. So in that sense, you're avoiding those associated emissions. When designing out waste, it's also about, let's say, thinking about how do you design cars with less material. If you have less material, your need for raw materials is lower and therefore lower emissions. But also, if you have less material, your car is lighter. If your car is lighter, your fuel consumption is less, and therefore also your emissions are lower. So that's example from designing out waste. And for keeping materials in use, here we are thinking about how can we design cars to be more durable, modular. How can you design the car in such a way that the components can be reused, remanufactured, recycled? What you're effectively doing is you're prolonging the lifetime of the car. And in doing that, you're preserving the energy for longer. But at the same time, by reusing these materials, you are avoiding new production, you're avoiding landfill, therefore avoiding emissions. And then I think a great example was recycling. Recycling is a lot less carbon intensive than the production of primary materials. So as an example, if we look at those 4 materials, steel, cement, and aluminum, as I mentioned earlier, these recycled materials can generate the processing generates 40 to 70% fewer CO2 compared to virgin material production. So that's a really interesting example where you can also save emissions. So that's the example for the car.
So the point being, extracting raw materials to then produce for the first time produces more emissions than when they cycle through the kind of loops of a circular economy, whether it's reuse or remanufacture or recycling.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's about making sure that you optimize the use of your materials, keep them in use for as long as possible, so you avoid them to be incinerated, where emissions are associated with that, but also avoiding new production if it's not necessary. Yeah.
And this really echoes kind of the Foundation's butterfly diagram. For anyone who's not familiar with that, I'm sure many people are, where we talk about the fact that those loops in the technical cycle they all they all have some reflection in terms of the embedded energy that's held within the product. And we don't have a loop for, there is no loop for if you have to make it all from new again. But the point is that all of the loops keep more embedded energy and value than making it fresh. And then as you go in, the different processes use less and less energy or new inputs.
Yes, absolutely. Would it be useful to give food? So if we look at the food system, it's slightly different because we're looking at the biological cycle. But if I start with designing out waste, it is quite similar, right? A lot of waste, if we look at food supply chains, around 25% of food is being wasted. And so how can you avoid unnecessary waste across the supply chain? So one of the things you could do is try to better match supply and demand. There's also an opportunity to redistribute surplus edible food for human consumption. By doing that, you're avoiding the production of food that you end up wasting, that people don't consume, and then get incinerated. So similarly there, you're then avoiding these emissions that are associated with new production and then incineration. Another element, keeping materials in use. Well, from a food system, we're talking about closing nutrient loops. So how can we, if we look at unavoidable food waste, things like food leftovers, agriculture byproducts, can we find a way to compost those? Can we find a way to bring those nutrients back into the soil? And by doing that, it can act as an organic fertilizer. So you're then replacing chemical fertilizers that are much more energy intensive for their production, but also you're creating healthier soils and preserving their carbon sequestration potential. And then the last principle, regenerate natural system, is a very important one, of course, for the food system. And here, regenerative agriculture is the critical one. So with regenerative agriculture, we're talking about practices that shift away from synthetic towards organic fertilizers. We're talking about employing crop and livestock rotation. It's about moving away from reducing tillage so that you don't disturb the soil and therefore release the CO2. It's about promoting agrobiodiversity. All of these things, the main impact of these things is that you are creating healthier soils, higher fertility, soil fertility, higher biological diversity. All of that preserves also and conserves the natural capacity of the soil to sequester carbon and act as carbon sinks. And a great example of a company, Indigo Ag, that has done an estimation on this, but they've shown that if we were to increase today's soil organic content of 1% to pre-industrial times, so 3%, that alone can help soak up to 1 trillion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So that really shows the importance of keeping our soils healthy. So this is the example for the food system.
Thank you, Suki. Sorry, jump in, Lara.
I just wanted to say and to underline something that I've kind of heard what you were speaking about this, which is sometimes the circular economy gets really related to Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. But you clearly have mentioned now many others which could benefit from just using the circular economy as a framework, like climate action, life below water, life on land, and I mean, you probably mentioned others that I've missed. So I just wanted to highlight this because I think that sometimes we talk, and especially even in the show, we're talking about the circular economy as kind of like an option, to get to those climate targets, but it's much more, it can have many other benefits.
Absolutely. I think the circular economy is a delivery mechanism really to achieving multiple goals. And so, whether that is resilience or economic growth or climate change. So I think this is a critical part. Yes, absolutely.
So we dove deep into this in the paper we published in September that you're a big part of, Suki. What can you tell us in a bit more detail? What kind of, so you've given us examples of how circular economy principles can help to tackle climate change. We talked a bit about the role and the place it sits, circular economy as a solution sits within tackling climate change. But what did we model and what did we explicitly find out in our research?
Yeah, so the paper is called Completing the Picture. how the circular economy tackles climate change. It was published last year, September, and it was written in collaboration with Material Economics, who's a consultancy in Stockholm. And to show the outcomes of the paper, we have slide number 2. If you could show that, it basically illustrates the key findings. So in the paper, what we wanted to show was the importance of addressing the 45%, right, which are the overlooked emissions that have to do with the way we produce our goods and manage our land. So to illustrate the opportunity, we modeled 5 key areas that are part of industries, very highly emitting industries. So we've focused on cement, steel, plastic and aluminium, as well as food. And when we apply the 3 principles I just explained earlier on, and we apply these 3 principles to these 5 key sectors, we find that a circular economy can reduce emissions by 45% for those 5 areas. And that is 9.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, which is the equivalence of eliminating emissions from all transport globally. So it really helps illustrate how that can help, how circular economy is key in helping us close this emissions gap. However, as you see, we still need the remaining 45%. We will still need other solutions like emerging technology, carbon capture storage, and also, diet shifts is a critical one to help us close this emissions gap all the way down to net zero emissions by 2050, which is critical if we are to meet our 1.5 degree target.
Thank you, Suki. And I think I would like, well, first of all, thanks the audience to all the questions that we're seeing coming up. I wish we could take all of them, but there is one from the audience that is quite related to a point that I wanted to highlight, which is that with COVID-19, we've obviously seen very quick and unprecedented, well, not unprecedented, but almost unprecedented reaction by policymakers, national governments, and cities taking control and measures to protect both people and the economy. And it's true that we haven't seen such a quick reaction with climate change. And Marcos on LinkedIn is saying that COVID-19 shows the effects in a very short term, while climate change, many people do not feel or perceive the effects in such short term. So how do we deal with this? How do we convince these people, or how can we influence and get a similar response with climate change?
I mean, that's a very important question, a very good question. I think now with the pandemic, what we've realized is how interconnected we are. I don't think we have much of a choice to not take action. In a way, the pandemic, it offers a glimpse of the future. The current levels of the economic disruption that we're facing today could become our reality in 2050 if we do not meet our climate goals. So like the pandemic, climate change is a global problem that is systemic in nature, and it affects us all in this interconnected world. So as we think about recovering from the pandemic, and we think about how to build back a better and more resilient economy, we really must think about how we can reduce the occurrence of future shocks, and like climate change, which is looming in the background. It's something we cannot avoid. And I think we've seen today already what a global crisis can do in this interconnected world. But apart from that, I think what's also very important to highlight is climate action, could really help accelerate the recovery. So by creating additional jobs, by driving capital formation, by increasing economic resilience. So there's also a lot of opportunities we can tap into. And so it is really important that climate change remains on the agenda as a key strategic priority for both governments and businesses as we tackle the coronavirus pandemic.
And we've talked about it a bit in episodes of this show already and in other places, but feels like that topic of resilience is really important. It's kind of like, it's the power of a circular economy. The linear economy is very much about efficiencies of scale. How do we optimize each independent piece of the system? The circular economy is about how do we optimize the system, and how do we, as part of that, how do we build resilience into it? We haven't got much time left, Suki, but I know that is a theme that we do just start to explore tentatively in the paper as well.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It's a very interesting topic and a very relevant topic today. And we've touched upon it in the paper. We've looked at regenerative agriculture and supply chains. I think for regenerative agriculture, there's a lot more evidence on that, right? So, I was mentioning earlier natural farming practices. The main impact of what you're doing is creating healthier soils. If you have healthier soils, then you are also improving the water retention capacity of those soils. So when you do that, you're increasing your resilience against climate change, because in times of flood, it can help absorb water and therefore reduce flood risks. But also in times of drought, it can help store water. And so farmers can have higher yields than normal. So this is from the regenerative agriculture. And then from supply chains, this is a less researched area. But I guess here we were hinting towards, well, as we are faced with climate change, we're going to have a lot more climate events and hazards. So hurricanes, floods, and storms will become more frequent in the future. And these can disrupt global supply chains in different parts of the world. And they can damage your supply. They can damage your operations and your material transport. So then here we're exploring, how can a circular economy increase resilience? And here, circular economy companies that are building flexibility and adaptability, there you have an opportunity to increase your resilience. So remanufacturing, reuse, repair, what you're doing, you're creating a more flexible business model that allows you to, let's say, get components from your clients, makes you less reliant, let's say, to raw materials on the other side of the world that might be very at risk to climate disruption. So it's all about, I think, in this case, building in flexibility, adaptability. But yeah, it's very context specific, and there's a lot more research that needs to happen in this area.
Great. Thank you very much, Suki. Suki, I want you to stick around because we're about to play for the first time ever on this show at 12:25, whatever the time is, BST, the Circular Economy Numbers game, where not only do you get to have fun, but you also get to learn something about the circular economy. And the numbers we're going to be exploring, I'd invite our I guess our contestants to turn their cameras on, or and the mics on. But so the numbers we're going to be looking at are going to be relevant to the conversation we've been having. So I welcome on to the show Rob Holmes, who anyone who's a fan of this show, if there are fans of this show, will recognize Rob, part of our learning team, and Matteo from the Make Fashion Circular team. No excuses, lads, for not getting these questions right. We're going to be asking you a question and giving you multiple choice answers, and we'll take it in turns. And if you get it right, you get a point. Whoever gets the most points gets to keep their job. So no pressure whatsoever. Let's just do a test of this just to make sure we understand the concept and the audience at home. By the way, if you're watching this online, pop your audience answers in the chat. Play along with us. We love to see you participating. Just to make sure question one, this is just a test to make sure we understand the concept of the show. So listen in carefully, Rob and Matteo. The question is, how does Seb like his cup of tea? Is it A, black, B, milk and sugar, or C, the tea bag with some boiling water brewed for 42.5 seconds, followed by a carefully added dollop of milk, and then you squeeze the tea bag out very carefully, firmly against the side of the cup, and deliver it to his desk with a smile? That's a buzzer beating round. Who knows the answer?
I think it have to be C.
Great. Okay. And the good news with that question is that you both now know whenever we do return to the office, whether it's September or whenever it is, you guys know exactly what you need to do. Right. On to the competitive part of the quiz. And the first question is going to be for you, Rob. Are you ready? Yeah, good.
Yeah,
so
ready.
Question 2 of this quiz, but the first question for you, Rob, is how often is the average car parked for during its lifetime? Is it A, 1%, B, 65%, or C, 91%?
Well, I think it's going to be C again, 91%.
91% of the time. You're right, Rob, and you get a point. Now, Lara and I talked about this quiz a little bit beforehand, and Lara, do you want to just make your point about that stat?
Yes, it's actually 92.
Okay.
But
so
we will still give you a point, Rob.
The point of that is that cars are extremely valuable assets, as Suki was going to describe in some of our examples. and we don't maximize their use. And actually, if we design systems where we much better utilized our cars, we'd also, of course, be saving on. There would be lots of environmental benefits to that. Okay, question 3, and the first question for Matteo. Matteo, you're 1-0 down already. So tricky
Try
one.
to catch up.
Remanufacturing parts in their Choisy-le-Roi plant provides Renault with energy savings of up to, is it A, 80%, B, 3%, or C, 70%?
I'm just gonna try to say C once again.
Matteo, I'm sad to tell you, it's wrong. It's A, 80%. You're surprised. And actually, Suki, I guess that's an interesting thing to come back to you on, because it probably will surprise some of our viewers at home just how significant the energy savings are when you're cycling things through. And also, I guess, worth mentioning that things like remanufacturing are easier to convert to renewable energy powered than some of the extractive processes.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess it's going back to all of the energy that went into making these components. By remanufacturing, what you're doing is you're allowing these materials to be reused, and you're preserving all of that energy that went into that. But you're avoiding new production, you're avoiding incineration, and so it has quite a big impact. There's a lot of value in these materials.
So we're on to question 4, which is Rob's second question. Rob, you've got a real opportunity here to put Matteo, leave him in your wake with this question. So the question is, 1 in every X number of calories is wasted before it even reaches the humans who are supposed to consume it. The missing number is either A, 10, so 1 in every 10 calories, B, 5, or C, 4.
Let's stick to the trusted C. 1 in 4.
Rob, I'm worried about your system for answering these questions, that you're just answering C every single time. That can't work in the long term. I hope you know that that's just not the right way to do it. But having said that, you are right. It is 1 in every 4 calories that are wasted across the value chain. Again, a startling statistic. And again, it speaks to, I guess, Suki was giving the example of the food system earlier in terms of the impacts, and it shows all the input, all the energy, everything that goes into the food sector. It's not a system that's effectively delivering calories and values at scale. There's a huge amount of waste across the value chain. Okay, but Rob is now 2-0 up as we go to question 5, which is Matteo's second question. Now, Matteo, you're under the pump here. You probably have been unlucky with the draw in terms of the questions. I accept that. But question 5 for you. This is taken directly from the Completing the Picture report, so it's also, Suki's probably going to be personally offended if you don't know the answer.
Perfect.
Cement makes up 7 to 20% of concrete. So cement is 7 to 20% of the concrete, but it's responsible for what amount of the CO2 emissions? Is it A, 50%, B, 25%, or C, 95%?
I'm gonna try and go with the middle one. So A, 50%. Suki, sorry if this is wrong, but I read your paper.
Well, yeah, you can't be expected to remember every single stat, and in fact, you haven't remembered every single stat. Amazingly, it's 95%.
Yeah.
Does that let's see, what is that like a kind of? That must have been quite surprising even for you, Suki, when you guys did the kind of ran the numbers on that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we didn't do necessarily those numbers. I think if you're working in the construction sector or in the built environment, those are quite, I think, common understanding. But the tricky part of it is that this cement is very highly emitting, right? So the question is, how do we design buildings either with less cement, or how do we make sure that the cement content is lower? But yeah, that's a big challenge for the construction sector, especially with the demand in the future, the demand for new construction, especially from emerging economies, is going to rise. So how do we deal with the rise in demand for construction while maximizing and optimizing the use of our materials? Yeah, it's going to be a challenging task, I think.
Right. Last 2 questions. One more question each.
Can I take one, Seb?
Yes, go for it, Lara.
maybe Rob maybe knows the answers because you've asked the questions, but let's see with this one. So question number 6, I think it is. Each year cities generate more than 600 million tons of organic waste. How much of this is put back into productive use? Is it A, 10%? Is it B, 2%? Or is it C, 5%?
Is this one directed at me? Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, difficult one. Let's go with 5%.
C again.
Yeah.
Well, your strategy is like the linear economy. It won't work in the long term. And actually, you're wrong. It's B, 2%.
Lots of opportunity to valorize the things that are flowing around our cities. And we've actually written a paper on this at the foundation called Urban Biocycles. It's kind of a position paper. It reflects on some of the existing knowledge out there. Definitely worth checking out. Laura, do you want to ask? Matteo needs a chance to redeem himself. And actually, it's the hardest question. Do you want to ask Matteo this last question, see if his luck changes with a different quizzer?
Yes, of course. So the last question is, by 2060, the built environment will build across the world the equivalent of the city of Paris. And the question is about the frequency. So is it A, each day, B, each week, or C, each month?
Okay, I'm gonna try and go for the worst one this time and try to see if I get it. So I'm gonna say each day.
What
Is
do you
that
think,
right?
Seb?
Suki, is that the right answer?
No, it's each week.
Come on.
The fashion guy gets all the built environment questions.
All the built environment.
It's every week, isn't it, Suki? Which is, you know, we've talked about cars, we've talked about food.
Yeah.
The built environment has a huge role. You know,
striking.
a huge role to play in terms of the amount of opportunity there is to reduce emissions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
That's the end of the first.
I mean, so
ever.
there's.
Go on. Sorry, go,
No,
Suki.
I was just going to add. I mean, this is specifically looking at construction, and so how can we, when we have this demand for new buildings, how can we design buildings that are low carbon? But it is also another. When we look at, let's say, for example, in Europe, where we have this whole existing housing stock, so there we're dealing with different challenges of how can renovation, for example, upgrading, refurbishing. So how can we renovate buildings in such a way that we keep the materials in use, that we are aware of the material compositions, and that we refurbish them in a way that we can help contribute to tackling climate change. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Suki. Thank you to our two first contestants in the first ever Circular Economies numbers game, where we have fun and we learn about the circular economy. I have to say, Rob, well done. You won that one 2-0. Maybe there'll be a second leg and it'll be on some of Matteo's specialist subjects. But thank you both, and thank you, Suki, for the added insights as well.
Thanks for having us, Seb. Waiting for the next one.
Just before we finish,
thank you for having me.
Just before we finish, I would like to remind our audience of what is happening next week. On episode 5 of the show, we will be exploring the answer to the question, how can art save the economy for the better? And art has always reflected and responding to what's happening around the world, but this is not a one-way transmission. And as one of the colleagues, which we will have in the show next week, always says, art can also help us see things in new ways. Just as a reminder, subscribe to our social media channels if you haven't already, to be notified every time we go live, all the information about all our shows, and you can also catch up on an earlier shows on our page at on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website. And thanks again to our wonderful speakers and to you watching us online, and see you next week.